Welcome to the pilot episode of the In Focus podcast. My name is Anthony Lightning. I'm a second-year politics and journalism student at Rhodes University. This podcast first came about out of necessity, a series of stories I needed to produce for my course. However, with the help of young producer Jordan, I hope this podcast grows out of that and turns into a platform where I can produce interesting content on topics that interest me and hopefully some of you too. It was on New Year's Eve 2019 when the World Health Organization received their first reports coming out of Wuhan, China, of a curious new virus. Fast forward to the 15th of March 2020, the world had pretty much come to a standstill, borders had been closed, and nations were declaring states of emergency, including President Ramaphosa, who joined the fight against COVID and declared South Africa to be in a state of disaster.
We have now declared a national state of disaster in terms of the Disaster Management Act.
It's been a little over 2 months since then, and South Africans are starting to adjust to a new normal. However, many of us are still left wondering, what exactly is a state of disaster?
A lot of us would have known about states of emergency, and throughout the globe, in light of COVID-19, a lot of the state response has been to enact a state of emergency. Now, in South Africa, it's provided for under Section 37 of the Constitution, and it says that in a state of emergency, certain civil liberties under the Bill of Rights, such as freedom of assembly, can be derogated from. Now, there are certain rights that you cannot derogate, so they must be upheld even in a state of emergency. And that is the right to dignity, life, and to fair trial. Now, a state of disaster is a little bit different. It's not expressly provided for under the Constitution, but rather it is provided under a piece of legislation known as the Disaster Management Act in 2002. Now, this provides what can happen and the process that should be followed in establishing a state of disaster. Now, what this piece of legislation does is that it gives powers and duties to a particular minister to exercise certain powers and duties in a state of disaster. And under this, certain rights can be limited. They're not derogated from, but they can be limited. And that is why we have had a number of regulations in South Africa introduced, which is limiting our freedom of movement, our freedom of assembly, and other restrictions on what goods we can and cannot purchase. Now, there has been an awful lot of conversation across the world. South Africa is not unique in this, about the impact that a state of disaster can have on civil liberties and democracy.
That was Professor Ciara Staunton. She's a senior lecturer in law and the LLB program leader at Middlesex University, as well as a senior researcher at Eurac Research's Institute for Biomedicine. Professor Staunton has also spent some time in South Africa, where she was a visiting fellow at the University of Cape Town's Genetics Department, as well as a visiting researcher at the Centre for Applied Ethics at the University of Stellenbosch. Professor Staunton was also an advisor to the South African National Institute for Communicable Diseases on strengthening its data protection framework. I spoke to Professor Staunton about the state of disaster in South Africa and the possible implications it may have on us now and in the future.
Under the Disaster Management Act, they can enact regulations that will protect the public, provide relief to the public, protect property, prevent or combat disruption, or deal with disruptive or other effects of the disaster. The emergency or the particular situation must fall within the definition of a disaster under the Disaster Management Act. And COVID-19 very clearly falls within that. You know, it is an issue of public health, and there are concerns about the impact it will have on its individual citizens. So absolutely, COVID-19 falls within the confines or the definition of a disaster, but there is discussions about whether or not the regulations that have been enacted as a result of the announcement of a disaster management of the disaster actually fall within the state of disaster.
Yeah, so there have been a lot of regulations that just don't seem to make too much sense. For example, some of the clothing regulations, we can only buy a shirt if it's marketed to be worn underneath a jacket, or we can only buy shorts if we're going to wear them with stockings underneath. Some really arbitrary regulations And in and amongst themselves, they don't seem like a very big deal. They're not huge injustices. But do you think small abuses of power like this could add up and provide a precedent for a bigger and more egregious abuses in the future?
Okay, I think there's a couple of points we need to make here. Yes, I have heard, and a lot of friends have been commenting on the arbitrariness of some of these regulations. I've had some friends who were pregnant who really struggled under the initial phase of lockdown. They couldn't get clothes to fit themselves. One friend, she was resorting to wearing the clothes of her husband because nothing else fitted her. So there are real impacts on, babies, for example, they grow at a remarkable pace. We need to have access to clothes. But one of the argument for having it so clear and so clearly laid down is so that there isn't police overreach. So if there was vagueness in the regulations, they would be interpreted on a level of the police. And there's a concern that if they elected the police to interpret it, there would be abuse.
Okay.
So on that side, that is why they're very, very clearly laid down. However, concerns that I would have, and I'm not just talking about South Africa, I'm talking about the regulations being passed the world over, is that this is a sign of things to come, and that these very detailed regulations and the incursion of the state into what is essentially our private lives could be start of something more. And this is where it's important that we have judicial oversight and parliamentary oversight. Now, judicial oversight is very clear. It's been exercised in South Africa. Parliamentary oversight becomes a bit difficult when there is no reason under the Disaster Management Act for Parliament not to meet. However, the rules around social distancing, for example, is limiting the ability of large groups to meet. Now you'll hear from my accent. I am not from South Africa. I'm currently hiding out in my parents' house in the west of Ireland. And there are challenges with our parliament meeting to deal with the situation because of the social distancing rules. They're trying to find ways around it, either having teleconference in so that certain members of parliament can video conference in, or do they only have a certain number of people meet? So we are trying to find ways around to ensure that we can't uphold the rule of law while having these regulations. But I think your point about that it could be used as a template for future, not so much abuses of power, but I would say, incursions on our civil liberties, it could very much be used for it. In other areas of which I would have huge concerns is around these contact tracing apps that we're seeing. The use of these apps for testing and treating. On paper, they sound absolutely necessary, that if, surveillance is a very important part in curbing the spread of this disease, and contact tracing is an essential part in curbing the spread of any infectious disease. We saw that in West Africa during the Ebola epidemic in Nigeria. One of the reasons why it really had managed to limit the spread of Ebola there was because it had a very good contact tracing process in place. Information technology has been kind of heralded, and these digital tools as an important part in our ability to spread this. On paper, yes, but they come with an awful lot of caveats, and there's a real possibility that they will limit our protection of privacy and our right to privacy. And I would have a concern that in trying to get to a new normal, whatever that new normal is going to be, we've heard a lot of people talking about that we will never return to normal, and our aim is to get to a so-called new normal. But in getting to this new normal, we are enacting laws and regulations that are limiting certain rights. And in using these limited and in these regulations that are limiting these rights, they will become normalized and a part of the new normal. And we need to make sure that this does not happen. Yes, there are times when we can't limit certain rights, but these are exceptional circumstances. And these exceptional circumstances, the process should not become normalized. And I think that is very important in getting to this new normal.
Yeah, there's been a lot of uncertainty surrounding the whole situation. We don't have much of a timeline as for when we can expect really anything. And part of this uncertainty is because the government's been limiting what information we can receive, but also because we just don't know certain things. We don't know when we could expect a cure, and we don't, or an effective treatment, and we don't know when we could expect a vaccine. Do you think there's a possibility that this uncertainty and this uncertainty of the timeline could be abused, and this state of disaster could be extended unnecessarily, and so we'd have to continue living under or living with limitations in our civil liberties?
Absolutely, yeah. With anything like this, there is the risk of abuse and not just in South Africa, but across the world. I have massive concerns about the limiting of access to information for citizens. And this has been a feature of the government's policy from the very, very beginning. It was very much trying to limit the voice. And it makes sense in one way. They want to make sure that there's no message and no spread of false information. And the spread of false news is something that we really do want to curb, because we don't want these fake cures or fake treatments getting out, even if one of the proponents of many of these fake treatments is sitting in the White House. But we really do need to spread the curve of this. But the focus should not be on disinformation, but there should be a huge focus on information and the spread of information. And what has been at the very beginning, the South African policy really failed in its lack of engagement with various sectors of society. If you are introducing policies which has a huge impact on the freedom of movement, the freedom of access to goods, the freedom of assemblies, you must be engaging with those who actually it impacts, particularly because of the economic consequences of these limitations on on a huge sector of society in South Africa. So that would be a concern that I would have had. I saw recently over the weekend, I think it was Professor Glenda Gray of the MRC, she was come out and criticising some parts of the government's policy. That's essential in a modern democracy. We need a mix of views. To have one voice kind of leads to this false assumption that science knows what's going to happen. All the science knows is that there's a huge amount that it doesn't know. And we need this dialogue and debate. And why it's important is that why we need this dialogue debate is because whatever happens in the rest of the world, and whatever policies and guidelines and treatment procedures and contact tracing procedures it follows in the rest of the world, yes, we can learn from them, but they must be contextualized to the particular circumstances that South Africa sees itself in. We saw at the very beginning that it's got high rates of HIV and TB, and there was concerns about the impact a lot of these comorbidities would have on the spread of the disease and the virus. And that's important to consider all of these factors in developing of these policies. And we have a certain number, South Africa is very, very lucky that it's with it's high level individuals who are advising the government, but they're not the only ones who are there. There's a huge amount of researchers who contribute to the ongoing debate on the development of these guidelines and policies, and their voices is essential. They must be heard.
Yeah, it's quite unfortunate that professor that you just brought up, who was very critical of some of the regulations that the South African government has imposed, our health minister was very upset with her comments and sort of attacked her because of those comments. So it seems like people in power aren't very open to public and transparent conversation, which is quite a concern, especially when you're living in South Africa. And these are the people who are not listening to experts. Well, we don't know if they're listening to experts because they haven't given us any information. But they don't seem very open to conversation, at least not publicly.
Yeah, we don't know what conversations are going on behind. So whether or not they've already listened to Professor Gray's comments, we don't know. But a hallmark of any democracy is this critique. And we need to be able to critique decisions that policy makers are made. Because the more you critique, the more you refine the policies. And a lot of these people, there may be no basis for their critique, but there might be a really valid basis that we should actually listen to. And I think the concerns that raised by Professor Gray and other people and other individuals should be heard and listened to and fed into this ongoing dialogue on what is an appropriate response in the South African context.
Yeah, this lack of willingness for conversation is very concerning.
The lack of,
the lack of the lack of conversation and the willingness of those in power, those making decisions, to have conversation is concerning. But what is also concerning is the lack of transparency. They've refused to release the minutes of the meetings while they've been discussing regulations. We only on Tuesday, they only just released the data that they've been looking at to make the model and the predictions that they've been using. They've only just released that data yesterday, so we've been left in the dark quite a lot. And I think for a lot of people, we don't know. We can't even formulate our own opinion because we don't know what data they're using. So we don't know whether these measures that they are taking is proportional in response to the threat that we have, which is concerning.
Yeah, I know. I would agree with you that, transparency is key about because you want to, in order for the regulations and any response to work, you want to have the support of those who it is seeking to oversee. So, for example, the general public. And in order for the general public to agree and follow through with any lockdown measures or procedures or policies that the government wants to do, they want to have the confidence. And there is an awful lot of sectors of society upset, and rightly so, who are angry. And because these regulations have really affected their livelihood and their ability and their basic human needs. So, I think that, transparency is key, and as much information as possible should be given to the general public in moving forward.
So you mentioned earlier that there's a difference between a state of emergency and a state of disaster, but that the state of emergency is not yet off the cards for South Africa. Under what grounds would a state of emergency be declared on top of the state of disaster, and what could we expect if it was to be declared?
It was mooted very early on when the president at the very early days of the state of disaster was actually asked, I think, on this point, or a member of government was asked, and they didn't rule it out at that point. I don't see it happening now. I really don't think that it would happen now. It's not politically viable because there would be further limitations of rights, and there would be we're looking towards kind of getting out of lockdown, whereas a state of emergency would be going back in. Okay. So I really don't see that happening for no other reason than politics is becoming, in the initial stages and with most government responses, it was very much about public health. Whereas now we see a lot of economic concerns, and the conversation shifting from one of just focusing on public health to the impact that public health regulations is having on the economic welfare of its citizens. So personally, I just don't see that happening.
Right. You mentioned earlier that parliamentary oversight during a state of disaster is really limited, especially during this situation. Part of that is because Parliament isn't involved in any decisions about the regulations, but also because Parliament has been limited. The ability to meet has been limited from the restrictions. So, is there any concern that one party during the state of disaster holds all the power, and the other parties representing South Africa do not?
I think, this is just a feature of modern democracies. In the UK, for example, Conservatives are in power. They have a large majority. They're making all decisions. They're making a lot of terrible decisions, but they are making the decisions because they've been democratically elected to this. There are other ways in which you can, so it isn't just parliamentary oversight, but there's committees, and in the UK, various committees are meeting to oversee the certain regulations. Obviously, it would be good for the kind of take up and support of these regulations if other parties are invited to feed into the development of these regulations. But under a modern democracy, if one party has been elected to lead to be in government, then that is what we're left with. What I actually think is much more important is not so much focusing on the parties and the engagement of the parties, but engagement with experts, those who know what we're talking about, and also community engagement, stakeholder engagement. I think it's essential that we have feed-in from community groups, community activists, those on the ground who these regulations are actually going to impact. It is essential that they are engaged with in development of these regulations. Business group, mining groups were consulted in the development of regulations in South Africa, but we need to go much lower. There are other stakeholders that are important to be taken into consideration. And we see that in any response, in any other infectious disease, such as TB, HIV, community engagement is essential for the support of the research and also any treatment and prevention campaigns. Equally so, COVID-19 is an infectious disease, and community engagement should form a central part of that. So we can learn a lot from what has happened in South Africa in the response to the HIV and TB epidemic. But I also think it's worth noting how community groups and community activists had an important part in the West African Ebola response. I think that is key, and that should be taken into consideration.
Okay. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate. I know I'm just a student, and this is just a small student production, but I really appreciate you willing to spare me some of your time.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. That was the first episode of In Focus. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it was informative at the very least. I am very open to critique. Let me know what you guys think. Drop me some hate mail, whatever. I just want to know what do you think about it. Yeah, and if you made it all the way to here, made it this far, thank you. I appreciate you listening to it. 20 minutes is a long time, so I really do appreciate you sparing me some of your time. Okay, cheers guys. Boom.